study together. We're glad that we have the opportunity to do such. And tonight we are going to be studying about peacekeeping. But I want to stop for just a moment and make sure to thank Brother Josh Walker for filling in for me last week. I enjoyed getting to watch his class online on YouTube, and it truly is a blessing to have all of the technology that we have in our world today to be able to still tune into something like that after it's been done, or even while you're not in the same state, whatever the case may be. And so it was a blessing to have the opportunity to listen to his lesson last week. I've got up there, I believe, the PowerPoint for tonight. I think I opened it up there. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. Tonight we're talking about peacekeeping. And I want you to imagine that tomorrow you go to pick up your paper and it says that there's peace, universal peace in this world. Would that not excite you? All of the news that you and I have watched for so many years now has been about unrest, whether it's unrest about the pandemic or unrest about ISIS or unrest about fill in the blank. There's always something going on that makes us a little bit uneasy, makes us a little bit concerned, makes us a little bit, sometimes even the right word would be scared. And how do we have peace in our world? We have peace in our world because we have to fight for it. And in our country, it's no different. We have people who dedicate their lives to work and to fight so that you and I can have freedom. And the expression goes, all gave some gave all. And in reality, you can see even just next door to us the amount of people who gave all so we could have peace in this country and not be overtaken by other people. And you see people together that are striving to help keep this country safe. Without them, we have no peace in this country. What a blessing it is to be able to have men and women that are willing to fight and to serve for us. But tonight, unfortunately, I can't tell you that the way to have spiritual peace is to go out and fight people. I can't tell you that the way to be spiritually at peace in this world with those that don't believe what we believe, those that don't hold to what we are supposed to believe according to Scripture, I can't tell you to go pick up a rifle and to go fight on the enemy lines to try to preserve that peace. In fact, the oddest war that you and I are in is that we cannot fight our battle physically speaking. I can't just go up to somebody that I disagree with and in order to have peace say, well, let's fight. And so tonight we're going to ask the question from a spiritual perspective. How do we have peace? Because we are still in a war. We're still fighting a battle, whether it's physical or spiritual, it's a battle nonetheless. And if you were to ask the question for the average person in America today, do you think America seeks peace? What do you think they would say? I don't think the answer would be yes, do you? So much of what we have experienced, not just the last 2.5 years, so much of what we've experienced for 10 years plus has been unrest and hardly any peace. We are at war with each other, and that is no place to find ourselves against our fellow citizens of our country, our neighbors, our co-workers. Part of the reason that we're at war with each other is there's nothing good to talk about according to the news. There's nothing good to talk about according to many people in our country. And so the only option left is to fight with one another. And there are so many people tonight that what they want you to take away about America is that you can't have peace here. It's just not possible. There's no way for you to have peace. There's no way for you to be a happy citizen of this country. You just can't do it. The Bible tells us a different story, though. And I want to take your attention over to James chapter 3, and I want us to look at this passage in James 3 and verse 18, where the writer there is quoted as having said, how you and I can have peace tonight is by doing something very specific and intentional. The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. I could stop the class right here and just say, you want peace? Be peaceable. You want peace? Be someone who makes your whole life about having peace. Obviously, I've got a lot more time to kill, and so I can't do that. But that really is the long and short of it as well, is to really just simplify it. It's verse 18. The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. But we have to ask the question, as we consider this passage of peace in James 3 and verse 18, how is peace described in the New Testament? Well, we're told in Luke chapter 1 and verse 78 that the dayspring from on high has visited us to bring peace. And so we can say that Jesus is our peace. I know the blessing that it is to be able to feel safe and secure at night. I also know that some places that you go, you don't necessarily feel as safe and as secure at night. How do you have peace when you're ready to go to sleep? When you feel safe, right? As a Christian, you want to feel safe, spiritually speaking. Jesus is that security. Jesus is the one that gives you that security, that peace, that makes it easier to live this life. Not that the life itself is just easy and there's no more difficulty, there's no problems, but that because of who is on our side, we can make it through those difficulties and problems and not worry about everything else as much. I used to worry a lot more than I do today, and I hope in 5 years' time I can say that I worried a lot more today than I do then. It's always a battle for me to get my mind to be able to just say, it doesn't matter. And for 5 years, I worked with a man named Ryan Manning. You know the Manning family well. And Ryan would often tell me, why are you stressed about this? And that would get on my nerves because I felt validated and, justified for being upset. And I felt invalidated by him when he says, it doesn't matter. Well, it matters to me. And Ryan would just simply look at me and go, and? It doesn't really matter. And for the longest time, I couldn't get that through my head. And then one day it clicked. What he was actually saying was, you're making it a bigger deal than it actually is. It's not that it doesn't matter. It's that in the grand scheme of things, with everything else that you could be worried about, this doesn't matter as much as the other stuff. I had a lot more peace after I realized that. As a Christian, I have a lot more peace today than I did when I found out that I was lost. I have a lot more peace today trying to live for the Lord and serve Him than I did when I found out that I needed to be redeemed. Restless nights. I don't know how people without the Lord make it. I don't know how they can convince themselves that that's a life worth living. They don't have peace. And they can have it. Jesus is willing to be anyone's peace if they'll simply seek that peace. But Jesus was also one that expected His disciples, when they would go out and preach the gospel, to be peaceable people. I sometimes get on Facebook and social media and other things and see brethren, even preachers sometimes, treat the gospel as if it is some type of mission to attack people. And I don't find that really to be borne out through Scripture, because in Luke chapter 10 and verse 5, when Jesus told His disciples to go from house to house, He told them when they would enter into a house to pronounce peace upon it. I don't think Jesus intended for just His disciples in that time to make that be their goal in their ministry. I think you and I can have conversations with people and still tell them that we believe that they're wrong, still tell them that we believe that they need to change the way that they're living, and tell them all of the things that the Scriptures would tell them without being mean about it. And much damage has been done with this crusade mentality in preaching and just in Christianity. we want to get them to see that what they need to do is change. We don't want them to walk away and say, that's the exact reason why I don't want to be a Christian. That person right there, the way they carry themselves, the attitude that they have, they're so combative. They don't care. We want to be seen as people who can present the gospel in a peaceful fashion. Yes, it is a war, and yes, we need to be diligent and vigilant even in what we're doing. But the Lord never told His disciples, hey, go out and make people feel bad about themselves for the entire time that you talk to them and see how many people you get to follow after you. But don't get it twisted. Jesus Himself would say things to people that would cut pretty deep. And we'll talk about that in just a moment, so just hold that thought. But Jesus wanted people to understand that the gospel, the good news, was that. It was good news. Not, oh no, here comes the guy that's going to tell me how I have to change my life and call me names and be mean to me for the next 20 minutes. Jesus expected His disciples to be peaceful. And they did that. And in Acts chapter 9 and verse 31, Acts 10 verse 36, Romans 10 and verse 15, tells us that by their peace, the gospel was multiplied among the people by the way that they carried it out. And they carried it out peaceably. But many people changed their lives because of what those disciples had to say. And according to 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verses 9 through 11, we're told that there were people that were homosexual that heard what they needed to do to change, and they changed and became Christians. And so it is possible to convince people, even with the sins that we would deem in our country probably some of the most prominent and in your face. I fly a lot with Delta. And Delta has started a new ad campaign when you're walking down the little jetway to get onto the plane, whatever they call that. They've got all these pictures advertising their company. And they've got two men cuddled up with each other, and the caption says, "This is what comfort looks like." That's not my idea of what comfort should look like in America. That's not the Lord's idea of what comfort should look like in America. And yet, at every turn, we're being told that that's supposed to be normal. Nothing really has changed from the time of 1 Corinthians to now in the sense of trying to normalize sin. And we can be successful by presenting the truth and letting the people that are listening to it make the determination for themselves. You and I can never force anyone to change. The disciples simply gave the gospel and let it do the work on the heart, and everyone responded, whether it was a positive response and they were added to the Lord's body, or it was a negative response and they went away shaking the dust off of their feet. But their tactic of peace and violence never flipped. They were always peaceable wherever they went. When we think about that text, what James is teaching us about peace, as we give the sense about James chapter 3, you have to first go back through the first few verses of James 3, because he didn't just randomly decide to end James 3:18 with the idea of the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. He had been building up to this point. He covers in the first few verses that there's a seriousness involved in the teaching of the Lord's gospel, and not everybody should be in that business of teaching. They receive a stricter, harsher judgment. And then he goes on and talks about in verses 2 through 8 on what we say is so crucial, because no man has ever been known to tame the tongue. Hadn't happened. And he goes on in verses 9 through 12, and he talks about being careful about being hypocritical in our speech. And then finally in verses 13 through 17, he shifts to wisdom, and he talks about how we can be sure that we're wise individuals, how we can have that wisdom. And then he ends it by saying the fruit of righteousness, how you and I can bear fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Doing things God's way brings peace. It's a simple thing. It really is. But we complicate it too often. Something I've noticed, I wouldn't say that it's happening a lot, but it's happening enough that it's perking my ears a little bit more, is this idea that the gospel cannot be simple. Now, I don't know if you've experienced this or not, but I've had discussions with some preachers and other people that are religious-minded even, and you'll present a simple argument. And it's almost as if that argument is not enough for them. There has to be a bigger, grander argument that would make it even more airtight and even better of an example than the one that you give. It can't be that simple. And if we're not careful, we're going to complicate something that isn't complicated. We're going to take something that's supposed to be very simple, the gospel, and try to turn it into something that it's not intended to be, which is complicated. Same with peace. It's James 3:18. And if you take away nothing from this class tonight other than how to have peace in your life, it's found in James 3:18. If I make my life about being peaceful, I will have peace. And that peace produces a fruit of righteousness. That's my whole goal anyway. That's what we all are striving for, I would hope. And I can only have that by doing something myself first. Sowing peace to make sure that I have peace. When you look at the context that surrounds James 3:18 about peacemaking or peacekeeping, the first several verses before it, in verses 13 through 17, we mentioned talk about wisdom. And it's interesting because we're told that it's not enough to just be a good person, verse 13. There are plenty of good people on this earth right now from a morality standpoint, many Corneliuses, if you will, that are living on this earth right now that are still lost. If Cornelius' goodness alone could save him, then Peter needed to not go to see him. There would have been no need for any gospel message to be preached. There would have been no need for any baptisms to take place that night. He was missing something. Being a good person doesn't make you wise. Knowing a lot doesn't make you wise. In verses 15 through 16, you can be wise by the world's standards and still do many evil works. How many people have we learned about throughout history that were brilliant? Absolutely brilliant in many ways. But they weren't what they needed to be spiritually. Henry Ford alone, you could argue, has changed the impact of this world with the automobile company that he had started years ago. But if someone starts an automobile company and for years and years and years and years and years it benefits the world, but the person who started it, they're never a Christian, if they never obey the gospel, did they really do something all that great for their own life? The whole purpose of life is not about fame and money. It's about being known by one. And that's the Lord. It doesn't matter if millions of people know my name if He knows my name. And many people are wise, but not what they need to be. We're told in verse 17 that wisdom is peaceable. I find that interesting. To be wise is to show peace instead of violence. To be wise is to be a peaceful individual. But the interesting thing about what surrounds the context of James chapter 3 and verse 18 is what happens in James chapter 4, where we're told that there's war. And that war comes about from us. In James chapter 4 it says, "Where do wars and fights come from among you? Don't they come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust, you don't have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? To be a friend of the world means you have no peace, because the only one that can give you peace is God. And when I make myself a friend of the world, I am now at war with God. And I ask this in the nicest way I can, but somebody point out one time where God has lost in battle. It hasn't happened. There has never been a time recorded in Scripture where someone got the better of God in war. Knowing that, is it really a smart proposition for us to say, you know what, we're going to be the first ones? We found a way that works better than God's way. We don't have to serve Him. We don't have to live for Him. We'll live for the world, and we will be victorious. We're going to be different than all the other times. You know, I have a 4-year-old at home that does not understand logic. And you can talk to him and explain it to him. You know, if you do that, this is going to happen. Yeah, I know. Okay, so don't do that. Okay. 5 minutes later, why did you do that again? Well, I thought that it wouldn't happen that time. We went over this. I thought it was pretty clear. If you do this, this is what will happen. Yeah, I know. Okay, so don't do that. Okay. What do you think happens 5 minutes later? Until finally, as if his punishment of doing it over and over again, it finally sinks in. Hey, you know, when I do that, this happens. I don't like it when this happens, so I guess I just shouldn't do that. And I would love to be a fly on the wall when his brain just clicks with that realization, to be able to go, I told you that several times ago, and you didn't trust and believe me. He's 4. He's not going to understand logic. Not yet. But oftentimes we find ourselves like 4-year-olds saying, no, this time it will be different. This time I can serve myself. I can be a friend with the world and fight God, and we'll actually win. No one else ever has, but we're going to. That's not how logic works. That's not how any of that works. But oftentimes we find ourselves in the same boat as James chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. We're at war, and we're not on God's side. And because of that war, there's no peace. And one of the things that was so horrifying about the pandemic was how ready and willing the church seemed to be in some cases to go to war with each other. I thought that church autonomy meant that an eldership could decide what the congregation was going to do, and it was up to the eldership of that congregation. And if that eldership made a decision, that the church membership would then need to do the best that they can to respect the elder, so long as it's a biblical decision. You know, it's not my job to contact churches in the area and ask them what they're doing in certain areas of judgment and try to figure out if they're on par with what I think they should be doing. But we had a lot of that going on back in 2020. Well, you're not doing it how my congregation's doing it, so you're wrong. I'm not a member at your congregation. I'm doing it the way that my eldership is set up, and I'm trying to be respectful to that, and there's nothing wrong with that. Well, I don't think you should do it that way. Now we're fighting with each other. And for what? Much damage has been done in the last 2, almost 3 years by just not allowing certain matters of opinion to stay matters of opinion. And I'm thankful that I have not experienced that here. I'm thankful I didn't experience that where I was working out in Somerville. But there have been many congregations that have been at war with themselves. And there's peace? There's no peace. There can't be peace when I'm fighting with my brethren. There's no success when I'm fighting with my own people. Now, as we shift to talk about what peacemaking is and what it is not, in the first place, peacemaking is knowing when to yield. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before, but Adam and I like to wrestle around, and I taught him to tap out. You ever become uncomfortable while we're wrestling around? You tap out, Daddy's going to let go. And so we'll be wrestling around, and all of a sudden I'll feel a little hand hit my arm, so I let go. It's also called knowing when to yield, knowing when you've been beaten. He could let me continue to hold him, but he's not able to get out of it, and he realizes the only way that I'm going to get out of this is if he lets go. And sometimes brethren can lock arms with each other, and they begin to squeeze and apply pressure, and the other is just waiting for the other to tap out and know when to yield. Maybe it's okay for one of us to just say, I give. Maybe it's okay to just simply say, that's all right. 1 Corinthians 8, Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 6, we're talking about those matters of opinion. And Paul didn't say, if you find somebody that has a differing belief or a differing view on something than you do, you make sure that you don't leave until they see it how you're supposed to see it. Is that what he said? If meat makes my brother to offend, if that causes my brother to stumble, I won't let him see me buy it, and I definitely won't invite him over and put it in front of him. In no way, shape, or form was Paul saying that eating meat was a sin. But what he's saying is, you have some brethren, they can't get over that fact that it was offered to an idol, and therefore it violates their conscience. So, don't try to get them to see it your way. And I actually find Romans 14 to be even more of a stronger case for this, because Romans 14 is basically him just saying, stop it. Just don't. There's no profit, there's no benefit in trying to argue over a matter of opinion. If it's not going to hurt the brethren from a spiritual and doctrinal standpoint, just yield. That's okay. You can lose without losing. It's fine to let some things go. That's how you can keep peace among the congregation. But in the second place, peacemaking is also upholding the pattern that's been set before us. We talked about on Sunday, Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 17, 1 Corinthians 13, 10, 2 Timothy 3, 16, and 17. Those passages are talking about how you and I can be at peace from a spiritual standpoint, which is do what this book says. And when I am tempted, 1 Corinthians 13, 10, I can look at this book and find numerous examples on people who chose peace instead of sin, people who chose peace instead of wickedness. And I can do that too. And so, if I want to be someone who's a peacemaker or a peacekeeper, I have to uphold that pattern that's been set before us. But as well as number 3, showing the gospel in what we would call a non-hostile way. You know, I wish to live in the time where we could genuinely go to someone's house, knock on the door, and say, can we talk about the Bible, and be met with the answer of, sure. I hear the stories from those that lived in a time where that was happening in our country. Yes, come on in. I've heard the stories of people who maybe they've been at work, they were in a Bible study with someone, and they disagreed on something. And the person said, well, let's see what the Bible says about it. And no matter what the Bible said on that issue, it settled the argument. Would you like to try that today? We're supposed to. But how confident would you feel today in a discussion where someone said, well, I think that homosexuality is okay. Well, I don't think it's okay. How would you feel confidence-wise to go in before those two and say, well, let me show you this passage real quick? What do you think might happen? A person's probably not going to like what the Bible says on homosexuality. And you might get called names. You might be told to be a hateful person, a bigot even in some cases. How do I show the gospel to someone who has a belief about the Bible that's hostile? Do I match the hostility? I could do that. I'm fully capable of doing that, but that doesn't mean that that's the way that I should go about it. Instead, I need to find a way to show it peacefully. Even if the person hates what the Bible teaches, even if they can't stand what the Bible stands for, one of the greatest things that you and I could ever have at our disposal is to still be seen by those people as good people, even if they disagree with the book. If they can look at you as a friend, I have found, at least in my own life, that those conversations on difficult subjects go a lot farther when I'm seen as a friend than when I'm seen as hostile. They're more receptive usually. They may not believe, they may not change their belief on something, but because they know that I appreciate and love them and respect them, they're more inclined to listen. And that sounds a lot like what I was taught as a preacher. When the brethren in a congregation know how much you care about them, that's when the sermons that are somewhat harder to hear are easier on the brethren to hear. Because they know that the person who's preaching it isn't just up there because he thinks it's fun to talk about a subject that's uncomfortable or talk about a subject that's going to make people upset. They're going to know that person loves me. That's why they're doing this. That's why they're preaching on this subject. It's not because they want me to go away. It's because they want me to be in heaven. They want me to do what's right. Showing the gospel in a non-hostile way is a requirement as a Christian. But also, in the fourth place, it's stopping division before it starts. I heard of a story, and I'm sure you've probably heard this story, but the story goes that there were some individuals that were in a country-type church, did not have any indoor plumbing, and they had made the decision they wanted to get indoor plumbing. And there was one family that made a big stink about that and said, we don't want indoor plumbing. We don't think that that's what we need to do. And so they left the church in that area, and they went to another congregation that already had indoor plumbing. Well, in all honesty, it doesn't appear that the indoor plumbing was the actual problem. Because if that's true, they needed to keep looking until they found a church that didn't have indoor plumbing. Something else must have happened, and they just used this as an excuse to go. People complain about the carpet, the paint, everything but the things that actually matter. And we divide on things that don't matter. And you and I have to try, when we can see the division brewing, try to step in the middle and stop it as best as we can. If only that had happened in Corinth and in Galatia. Think about the heartache that could have saved. If only people had been aware of the fact that division is not what the Lord intends, those chapters in our Bible, those books might read a little differently. But that's what peacemaking is, so what about what peacemaking is not? It's not a passive activity. It's not something that I decide to do as kind of like a hobby. No, it's supposed to be my whole life. We mentioned on Sunday that the church, the early church, they were successful as a church because of what they did in Acts 2:42 through 47. If I do that, I'm going to have peace. The church will have peace. The community around me can have peace if I am making my life about serving the Lord as they served. But peacemaking is also not holding the exception as the standard. I've seen well-intentioned people trying to justify violence in general even by going to John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22, where Jesus is mad enough that he grabs a whip and he chases people out of the temple. And the argument is often made that, well, since Jesus did that, I'm okay to then respond in violence when I see fit. But there's two problems with that. First, Jesus had genuinely seen and watched Jerusalem and what they had become, and it broke his heart. That's why he's quoted as having wept over the city and lamenting over them, how he would have gathered them as a mother hen gathers her chicks, but they weren't willing. But second, Jesus, and probably the most damning to this view, Jesus was in direct opposition with the Pharisees and Sadducees on multiple occasions, and there's only one written occurrence where he grabbed a whip. Why? Evidently, that wasn't supposed to be the standard. It was the exception to the standard. Evidently, in Matthew 23, when Jesus spends 36 verses rebuking them profoundly, there was no whip in sight being brought out by Jesus because that wasn't the time to do that. And we have to be careful to not hold an exception as our standard. That's not peacemaking. Number three, it's not refusing to fight, which that sounds almost oxymoronic, if you will, because here we just said, be peaceful people, you don't always have to grab a whip. But Jude 1:3 tells us that we are contending for the faith. From a spiritual standpoint, I have to fight for peace. We mentioned our veterans and how they fight for our peace. Spiritually speaking, I've got to fight to have peace as well. Now, in the fourth and final place of this point, and then we'll move to the application very quickly, peacemaking is not accepting everyone for who they are. We hear that a lot right now. Come as you are. Leave with no change, basically. And in Jeremiah 6:14, chapter 8 and verse 11, as well as verse 15, we find prophets saying, oh, no, you're not going to be in captivity that long. That's not going to be a huge problem for you. You don't have to worry about the captivity. Look, there's peace right now. They professed peace, and there was no peace. And there were many people going around at that time thinking that they were fine simply because they were having false prophets telling them, you're okay, don't worry about it. God's just going to accept you for what you are and how you are. They must have forgotten to read Deuteronomy Chapter 28, which has 68 plus verses in it, and the first 14 verses are about all of the blessings that will come upon you if you follow the Lord. The rest of the chapter, the majority of the chapter, is about all of the problems that will come upon you if you don't serve God, and the chief problem among all of them is you'll go into captivity. God warned them long before it happened that it would happen. Now, by way of application, there's three places that we need to try to seek peace. Number one, we seek peace in the home. A true change genuinely starts in the home. If you want to change America, if you want to change our world, it starts in the home. It has to start in the home. Somewhere along the line, mothers and fathers were not training their children like they're supposed to, and we got adults that were not raised with good moral values. And we have to put that back into the home if we're going to stop what's happening to our country. That's where it starts. But peace in the home is only found with God. It's not found with anyone else or any other type of teachings and writings. It's truly found with God. Second, seek peace in the church. The church can't fall victim to civil war. We can't be fighting with each other. And we can all pitch in and labor together because we're all trying to get to the same place. And third, the hardest one, seek peace in the world. There are going to be people that are just downright mean and cruel to us, but we still have to try to give them the opportunity to have peace. And because you and I serve Christ, because of this, the world will despise and reject us. And there's always a battle to fight, but it doesn't mean that we have to do it with hostility. To have peace is exactly what all of us should want, and we can have it by sowing peace in our own lives first. And what will bear fruit from that is righteousness. Lord willing, next week we'll be back to pick up our study again on the What Does the Bible Say About series.